Welcome to our lesson summary, God's wrath revealed. Romans 1 verses 18 through 23. The big idea of this section is when people reject the truth about God, they replace him with something else. So Paul, he opens Romans by calling himself a servant of Jesus Christ, not an apostle, with titles and credentials, but a servant. That tells you something right away about where this letter is headed. He's not writing to impress anybody. He's writing because people need to hear the truth. And by the time we get to verses 16 and 17, it seems like Paul, as one scholar said, he's fired up. He says the gospel is the power of God that brings salvation and reveals the righteousness of God through faith. But before he gets to the good news, he actually starts with the bad news. He does something that a lot of preachers, not our pastor, right? But what a lot of preachers do is they skip over. He gives us the bad news first. You can't fully appreciate a rescue, right? Unless you understand how serious the danger was. You can't appreciate a doctor unless you understand how sick you really are. And you can't appreciate salvation unless you understand the weight of sin. So, starting in verse 18, Paul pulls back the curtain and shows us why the whole world needs the gospel so desperately. First of all, wrath revealed. The wrath of God is revealed in verse 18. The theme here is sin provokes God's wrath. God, in a nutshell, we know this, he cannot stand to be in the presence of sin, and he can't stand it when his own children are committing sin, let alone, for that matter, those who have, and we'll get to that part later, those who rejected him in sin. Before Paul tells us how God saves sinners, he tells us why sinners need saving. He says the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. Now, some people they hear that and they get uncomfortable. One scholar said you'll hear people say, and I've actually heard people say this: I believe in a God of love and not a God of wrath, right? Like, what kind of theology is that? That's not biblical. Here's the thing. Those two are not opposites. They're actually one and the same. A parent who loves their child gets angry when someone hurts that child. A judge who loves justice gets angry at injustice. God's wrath is not him losing his temper or losing control as far as anger out of control. It is his holy reaction, we're talking about his wrath, to everything that destroys what he made and loves. You don't have to have a God. You don't get to have a God, rather, who loves people and not get a God who hates sin. He's one and the same. He loves people, but he also hates sin, as I already mentioned. And for anyone who thinks the New Testament God chilled out, because some people say that, God of the Old Testament, he was really a God of wrath. But when I look in the New Testament, he's really a God of love. No, he didn't chill out in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, read the book of Revelation. Read the whole New Testament, for that matter. Read the book of Acts, Acts chapter 5. In the infancy of the early church, Ananias and Sapphira, when they lied to the Holy Spirit and dropped dead on the spot, that shows you just how much God hates sin. His wrath is revealed. In other words, sin provokes God's wrath. So the God of the New Testament is the same God of the Old Testament. He just added a rescue plan. That's what he did, in essence. When the first Adam fell, the second Adam, Jesus Christ, God provided the second Adam in his rescue plan. So Paul says this wrath is provoked by three things in verse 18. Number one is provoked by ungodliness. That simply means sin against God. When you go back to what happened in the Garden of Eden, ungodliness doesn't mean, for example, you cuss a lot. Although that goes with the territory, right? That ain't a good thing, right? It's sinful, or to stay out of church. That's also sinful. What it means is to live as if God doesn't factor into your decisions. In the words of the late A. Lewis Patterson Jr., to leave God totally out of your thinking. You leave God totally out of your thinking. It's the posture before God that says, I got this. I don't need you. Every single morning, without ever acknowledging the one, we're talking about God, who allows you to see another day. It goes all the way back to Genesis, as I mentioned, when Adam sinned. It wasn't just a rule that was broken. It was a relationship that got fractured. So ungodliness is sin against God. But then another way that God's wrath is revealed is through unrighteousness of people. Unrighteousness, that's sin against others. So ungodliness, that's sin against God, but unrighteousness is sin against others. Once the relationship with God breaks up, our relationships with each other start to fall apart. Remember Cain and Abel? Well, we saw that in the Garden of Eden for that matter, but Cain and Abel didn't happen centuries after Adam and Eve. It happened in the very next generation. Sin doesn't stay private, it spreads. So unrighteousness is what you get when ungodliness goes unchecked. It's like a slippery slope. One thing leads to another, like an avalanche. By the way, an avalanche actually starts as a small fracture, but then it can actually reach speeds, from what I read, within 5 to 10 seconds, speeds of 60 to 70 miles per hour. So sin or unrighteousness can start small, but when it goes unchecked, it gets out of control. It becomes a large avalanche that can do a lot of damage. So it moves from unrighteousness, sin against others. Well, let me back up. It moves from ungodliness, sin against God, to unrighteousness, sin against others. And then finally, it results in unbelief, suppressing the truth. This is the one that gets personal. Paul says people suppress the truth. Not that they never heard it, right? Not that they couldn't find it. They know it, but they keep pushing it down because they don't want God telling them how to live. Dr. Tony Evans said it well. I like this illustration. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater at a pool. You ever tried to do that? Hold a ball underwater? It's almost impossible. You push that ball down with both hands, but the moment you let up, it shoots right back up out of the water. Why? Because the air inside keeps pushing it upward. If you want to keep it down, you have to keep forcing it under water. This is exactly what people do with the knowledge of God. Every sunrise is evidence. That's proof, okay, that God exists. Every newborn child is evidence that God exists. Every time you escape something that could have killed you, that is evident. It wasn't by chance. It wasn't by your own whatever. Like if you're driving in a car and you were almost killed, it wasn't your driving skills that saved you. That was evidence of God. But instead of surrendering to it, people kept forcing it back down because they want to stay in charge of their own lives. The problem is it's not a lack of evidence that God doesn't exist. There's plenty of, this is called general revelation, by the way. There's plenty of evidence that God exists. Proverbs 17:19 says, he who loves transgression loves strife. That's the problem. People push the truth down, not because they can't see it. They push it down because they love sin. Problem is that we have a sin nature. Remember that we got from Adam and Eve. But thanks be to God for the second Adam, Jesus Christ. Now we have a new nature. Now we got the new man and the old man. They don't get along. They war against one another. There's a struggle on a daily basis. But for the unbeliever, it's just the old man. For the unbeliever, it's the one who is, it goes beyond just breaking the rules. For the unbeliever, it's the one who refuses to let God be in control. So questions to ponder: what is something God has been putting in front of you that you keep pushing to the side? And is there a truth about your life you already know but have been avoiding? What would it cost you finally to respond to it? And so wrath is revealed. The wrath of God is revealed. The witnesses of God are revealed. Verses 19 and 20. The theme here is creation has been preaching about God the whole time. If anyone says, again, we're still talking about general revelation. If anyone says they don't know whether God exists, Paul says creation has already answered that question. You lying and the truth ain't in you. That's just my little feeble fishology that I had to add in there. It's the truth. In other words, nobody on the face of this earth, I don't care if they live in a remote location, creation has been preaching to you all along, God exists. Nobody, and we'll see this in just a second, you've already read it, nobody will have an excuse. So witnesses reveal. The first one here, God's power is visible. Verse 19. Paul says God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen through what he has made, creation. Just look at the sky on a clear night in the country or wherever you are, where there are no city lights. Look at the complexity of the human immune system. Look at how a seed knows to grow up toward the sun and push the roots down into the ground without anybody teaching it to do that. I remember when I was a kid, my mom showed me something about, God's creation. It was a simple illustration that she showed me of a flower. And my mom loved flowers. She loved to plant. Had flowers going all the way around the house and all of that. But we had some flowers in the house, and she showed me something. She said, watch, I'm going to turn this flower around and where it was facing me, away from the window, in other words, and give it a few days and watch what happened. And so every day I would go and watch that flower. And it was so amazing to me to watch from day to day how that flower turned toward the window. That's God's creation. That's God's creation literally saying, look at God. God made me. I'm going to turn towards what God has created. In other words, it's turning towards the sun. I can't explain it like I'm sure some of you can, but you understand what I'm talking about. Try it. If you don't believe me, I double dare you to try it. Turn a flower away from a window. Make sure you leave it there and give it a few days and watch how that flower will turn towards creation. Nobody tells, by the way, the seasons when to change. Nobody winds up the ocean. As a matter of fact, nobody can tell the ocean, hey, you can only come so far. God did that. Creation is not an accident. It's not about the Big Bang Theory. No, that's not what happened. Everybody knows, or should know, based on what they see in creation, God exists. So God's power is visible. Verse 19, God's presence is universal. Paul says that people, here it is, I've been saying it, without excuse. There will be no excuse. Nobody will be able to stand at the great white throne and say, well, nobody ever witnessed to me. Nobody ever told me about Jesus Christ. So, so I get a pass. No, you're not going to get a pass because God has been showing you all along. That phrase right there, Paul says people will be without excuse. That phrase is not a technicality. It is a statement about the fairness of God. He did not hide himself and then punish people for not finding him. He put the witness of his existence in front of every human being who has ever lived. So think of it this way. Imagine you're walking in the woods. You find a watch lying on the ground, right? You ain't going to say, well, wow, look at what the wind accidentally put together. You ain't going to say that. No. You're going to pick up that watch immediately, and you know somebody made that watch. In other words, the design tells you there's a designer. Now, think about the human eye with its millions of light-sensitive cells, right? Its ability to adjust instantly between darkness and bright light. its connection to the brain. If a watch proves there is a watchmaker, creation proves there is a creator. Every sunrise is God's testimony. He's literally saying to the whole world, hey, I'm here, I exist. Every heartbeat, every breath we take, everything is it's on his witness stand, and it's letting the world know that he exists. Creation tells us God exists. Scripture tells us who he is, and Jesus shows us what God is like. So when you look at the sky, the seasons, the way life is going, life keeps going, even through the hard times, what does that tell you about God? What has God already revealed to you that you haven't fully responded to yet? And then finally, wickedness is revealed, verses 21 through 23. The theme here is humanity replaced God. Like I said earlier, man rejected God. So here's what Paul gets to the heart of it. The problem was never a lack of evidence that God exists. The problem was man rejected God. People knew God and they chose something else. Verse 21, they refused to honor him. People want God's benefits without God's authority. Here it is. They want the blessing without the boss, right? They'll pray when they need something, but like he doesn't exist when things are going fine. In other words, we're going to pray when I need something, when turmoil is going crazy, when things are going crazy in my life, storms are in my life, I'm on my knees. But as long as everything is going fine, God ain't going to hear from me. Wanting God's hand without submitting to his lordship is not faith. It's just using him like a spare tire. And that's about the only time that people who refuse to honor God, that's the only time they think about God, when they need him. Like a spare tire. When the last time you even checked to see if you had a spare tire in your car? Then they refuse to thank God. Verse 21. Gratitude keeps a person humble because it reminds us that what we have did not start with us. Every blessing comes from somewhere. Let me say it another way. Every blessing that we have, every blessing we have received, it came from God. Life, breath, ability, opportunity, and provision all came from God. It wasn't by chance. It wasn't by luck. It wasn't because we were smart enough. It wasn't because I got multiple degrees on. None of that. God, everything I have came from God. Yeah, as we say, what I know, the Lord taught me, right? Where I came from, God brought me, and where I'm going one day, God is going to have to take me. But an ungrateful heart begins to say, I did this. I built this. I learned this. The moment you stop thanking God, you start taking credit for things he gave you. That is why ingratitude is so dangerous. It slowly pushes God out of the picture until a person begins to believe they are the source of their own life. That's the saddest. Oh my God. I'm gonna keep going. That is a sad testimony of anybody's life. And once you take credit for the gifts, it's not long before you start thinking you don't need the giver. Like the person who thanks their boss for the promotion, but never once thanks God for the ability, the health, and opportunity that made the promotion possible. God is the one who opened that door. And then finally, verses 22 and 23, they refused God with idols. They replaced God with idols. So finally, Paul says they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, for humans, for animals and things. In other words, for temporary stuff. They traded the eternal for the temporary. That's a better way of saying it. Now we tend to hear this word idol and picture someone bowing to a golden statue. But idolatry didn't disappear. It just got more sophisticated. In many of our communities, the real idols are things like reputation, what the neighborhood thinks about you, family approval, letting people pleasing run your entire life, hustle culture, grinding so hard that there's no room for God, rest, or relationships. And sometimes the idol, believe it or not, can be the church itself, going through the religious motions without ever actually encountering the living God. It would be like somebody trading a brand new car for a busted bicycle. Of course, everybody would say, what in the world? What's wrong with you? That doesn't make any sense. But that is exactly what humanity did, and they're still doing it today. God offered himself, his glory, his truth, his presence, his love, and people said, and they're still rejecting God today. They're saying, no, thank you. I'd rather have this temporary stuff. I'd rather have money. I'd rather have status. I'd rather have pleasure. I'd rather have a presidential position. I'd rather have power. They traded the creator of the universe for the things that cannot even save their souls. So the application is, ask yourself honestly, what has taken the place of God in my life? It doesn't have to be something evil. It could be your career. And really, that's how Satan operates a lot of times. He'll take something that's actually good, and before you know it, it'll take the place of God. It could be a relationship. It could be a career. It could be your comfort. It could be your reputation. Anything you cannot, watch this, anything that you cannot imagine your life without, anything you would rather keep than give to God, that's your idol. So is there something in your life that you're holding on to more tightly than you're holding on to God? Are you worshiping the Creator or something he created? So as I close, Paul has been building this case. Sin, remember, it leads to suppression. Suppression leads to idolatry. Idolatry leads to darkness. Verse 21 says their thinking became futile and their hearts became darkened. That is what happens when you keep pushing the truth down and filling the space with something else. But here's the gospel. That exchange doesn't have to be permanent. It can be reversed. The same God whose wrath is revealed in this passage is the same God, because he's not just a God of wrath, remember? He's also a God of love. And that same God who sent his son to absorb that wrath on our behalf, we should thank God that Romans doesn't end at chapter 1. Praise the Lord. It moves through the bad news so that we can understand the magnitude of the good news. By the time we get to Romans chapter 5, Paul says, while we were yet sinners, not after we cleaned ourselves up, by the way, but while we were yet sinners, Christ died. Not after we got it all together, but after Christ died for us and rose again. That great exchange Paul described, trading the glory of God for the things that cannot save. That exchange can be reversed. You can trade the idols back in. You can stop suppressing the truth and start surrendering to it. You can stop worshiping what God made and go back to worshiping God himself. And when you do, when you make that decision, this is not just some religious decision, by the way. It is coming home. Eternally, that is. It is God bringing you out of darkness into his marvelous light. It is the beach ball finally allowed to rise to the surface. Creation has been preaching all along. The question today is, are you finally ready to respond? To God be the glory.